Welcome to Today in History, our channel, where we dive daily into the most fascinating, weird, and mind-blowing events that have happened throughout time. In addition to our daily videos, we also delve into the lesser-known aspects of history, exploring the events and actions that have shaped our world. Today, we are diving into the Vikings. The very name conjures images of fierce warriors, longships slicing through icy waters, and epic raids that struck terror into the hearts of medieval Europe. For nearly 3 centuries, these seafaring Norsemen dominated the North Atlantic, leaving their mark from the British Isles to the shores of North America. But who were the Vikings, really? And what brought their extraordinary era to an end? Today, we delve into the rich history of the Vikings and explore the complex factors that led to the decline of one of the most legendary cultures in history. The origins and rise of the Vikings. To understand the Vikings, we must first journey back to their origins in the rugged landscapes of Scandinavia. The Viking Age began in the late 8th century, around 793 AD, when a group of Norsemen launched a brutal raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the coast of England. This event marked the beginning of what would become a nearly 300-year period of Viking expansion and exploration. The Vikings hailed from what is now modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These lands were harsh, with long, cold winters and limited agricultural potential. This environment bred a resilient people who were skilled in seafaring, trade, and warfare. Their ships, known as longships, were marvels of engineering, fast, flexible, and capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. These ships allowed the Vikings to launch surprise raids deep into Europe, taking advantage of the continent's fragmented political landscape. But the Vikings were more than just raiders. They were also traders, explorers, and settlers. As they ventured beyond Scandinavia, they established trade routes that stretched from the Middle East to the North Atlantic. Viking traders brought back goods such as silk, spices, and silver, which were then exchanged for furs, timber, and slaves. This extensive network of trade not only enriched Viking societies, but also facilitated cultural exchange, spreading Norse influence far and wide. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Vikings had established settlements across Europe, including in Ireland, Scotland, and the northern coast of France, where they founded the Duchy of Normandy. They even reached as far as Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, what we now know as Newfoundland in Canada. These far-flung colonies demonstrated the Vikings' incredible maritime prowess and their willingness to adapt to new environments. The Viking Age was a period of dynamic change and expansion, driven by a combination of economic opportunity, political instability in Europe, and the restless spirit of the Norsemen. Yet, despite their successes, the Viking Age was not destined to last forever. Before we move into the next chapter, we would like to ask you for a favor. If you are enjoying the video, please support us by subscribing to our channel, click the like button, and share the video. It means a lot to us. Thank you. The impact of Christianity. One of the most significant factors in the decline of the Viking Age was the spread of Christianity. In the early years of the Viking Age, the Norse practiced a polytheistic religion, worshipping gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. Their religious beliefs were deeply intertwined with their way of life, influencing everything from their social structure to their approach to warfare. However, as the Vikings expanded their territories, they came into increasing contact with Christian Europe. Christian missionaries, particularly from the Frankish Empire, began to target the Viking leaders, recognizing that converting the elite could lead to the eventual Christianization of the broader population. The conversion of Viking rulers to Christianity was often a strategic decision, driven by political and economic considerations as much as spiritual ones. For instance, King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark converted to Christianity around 965 AD, partly to secure alliances with powerful Christian kingdoms and to legitimize his rule. The adoption of Christianity had profound effects on Viking society. As the new religion took hold, it began to erode the traditional Norse beliefs and practices that had defined Viking culture for centuries. Christian moral values, which condemned practices like raiding and slavery, clashed with the Vikings' traditional way of life. Over time, the Viking practice of raiding became less common, partly due to the influence of Christian teachings that emphasized peace and forgiveness. Moreover, the conversion to Christianity brought the Vikings into the broader European political and cultural sphere. This integration helped to pacify the Vikings, turning them from raiders into settled rulers who sought to build stable, Christian kingdoms. By the 11th century, most of Scandinavia had converted to Christianity, marking a significant shift in the region's identity and signaling the beginning of the end for the Viking Age. The rise of stronger centralized kingdoms. Another crucial factor in the decline of the Viking Age was the rise of stronger, more centralized kingdoms in Europe. During the early years of the Viking Age, much of Europe was politically fragmented, with numerous small kingdoms and principalities that were easy targets for Viking raids. However, by the 10th and 11th centuries, many of these regions had begun to consolidate into larger, more powerful states. The emergence of strong monarchies in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire made it increasingly difficult for the Vikings to continue their raiding and pillaging. These new kingdoms had the resources to build more effective defenses, including fortified towns and castles, and they could muster larger, more organized armies to repel Viking invaders. One of the most significant turning points was the reign of King Alfred the Great of Wessex. In the late 9th century, Alfred successfully defended his kingdom against a massive Viking invasion, eventually forcing the invaders to settle and convert to Christianity. Alfred's victory marked the beginning of the end for Viking dominance in England and set the stage for the eventual unification of the English kingdoms. Similarly, in France, the Viking threat was gradually neutralized through a combination of military force and diplomatic agreements. The most famous of these agreements was the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 AD, in which the Viking leader Rollo was granted land in northern France in exchange for his loyalty to the French king. This land became known as Normandy, and Rollo and his descendants became powerful Christian lords who played a crucial role in European history, including the Norman conquest of England in 1066. As the power of these centralized kingdoms grew, the Vikings found it increasingly difficult to carry out their traditional raids. The very success that had once allowed them to dominate Europe now worked against them, as they faced better organized and more formidable opponents. Family life. While the external pressures on the Vikings were significant, internal changes within Viking society also played a role in the decline of the Viking Age. One of the most critical aspects of this internal transformation was the evolving nature of Viking family life. In the early Viking Age, family life was centered around the extended family or clan, known as the Æt. These clans were the building blocks of Viking society, providing individuals with identity, support, and protection. The loyalty to one's clan was paramount, and disputes were often settled within the family rather than through external authorities. As the Vikings settled in new territories, their family structures began to change. The traditional clan system gradually gave way to more nuclear family units, especially as the Vikings adopted Christianity. The new religion emphasized the sanctity of marriage and the importance of the nuclear family, leading to a shift in social norms and values. This shift had significant implications for Viking society. As family life became more centered around the nuclear family, the importance of the extended clan diminished. This change weakened the social cohesion that had once been a hallmark of Viking culture. The decline of the clan system also meant that individual families were more likely to integrate into the broader Christian society, further eroding traditional Viking practices and beliefs. Moreover, the Christianization of family life brought with it new legal and moral codes that were at odds with traditional Viking practices. For example, the Christian Church condemned polygamy and concubinage, practices that had been relatively common in Viking society. The Church also sought to regulate marriage and inheritance, imposing new rules that undermined the power of the traditional clan leaders. These changes in family life were not just a reflection of the broader Christianization of Viking society. They were also a driving force behind it. As more and more Viking families adopted Christian norms and values, the cultural and social fabric of Viking society was fundamentally altered. The result was a gradual but inexorable decline in the traditional Viking way of life, as the old clan-based society was replaced by a new, more Christianized social order. Sexual norms and social changes. Another critical factor in the decline of the Viking Age was the changing sexual norms and social practices within Viking society. In the early Viking Age, Norse society had relatively liberal attitudes towards sex and sexuality. Sexual relations outside of marriage were common, and both men and women enjoyed a degree of sexual freedom that was unusual for the time. Viking society was also relatively egalitarian in terms of gender roles. Women in Viking society could own property, divorce their husbands, and even participate in raids and battles. This relative equality extended to sexual relationships, where both men and women had a say in choosing their partners. However, as the Vikings became more integrated into Christian Europe, these liberal attitudes began to change. Christianity brought with it a much more rigid set of sexual norms, emphasizing chastity, monogamy, and the sanctity of marriage. These new norms were enforced by the Church, which sought to regulate not only sexual behavior, but also social practices, such as marriage and inheritance. The imposition of Christian sexual norms had a profound impact on Viking society. Practices such as polygamy, concubinage, and divorce, which had been relatively common in Viking society, were now condemned by the Church. The new Christian moral code also placed a greater emphasis on female chastity and modesty, limiting the freedoms that Viking women had previously enjoyed. These changes were not just a matter of personal behavior. They had broader social and political implications. The Christianization of sexual norms led to a decline in the social status of women, as their roles became more restricted and controlled by the Church. This shift also contributed to the decline of the traditional clan-based society, as the new Christian norms undermined the power and influence of the old clan leaders. The changing sexual norms and social practices of the Viking Age were both a cause and a consequence of the broader Christianization of Viking society. As the Vikings adopted Christianity, they also adopted the social and moral codes that came with it, leading to a fundamental transformation of their culture and society. Economic and environmental pressures. In addition to the social and cultural changes that contributed to the decline of the Viking Age, there were also significant economic and environmental pressures that played a role. The Viking economy was heavily dependent on raiding, trading, and agriculture. In the early Viking Age, the wealth generated from raids provided the resources needed to support Viking society, funding everything from the construction of longships to the maintenance of armies. However, as the Viking Age progressed, the opportunities for raiding began to decline. The rise of stronger centralized kingdoms in Europe made it increasingly difficult for the Vikings to carry out successful raids, and the profits from raiding began to diminish. At the same time, environmental changes were also affecting Viking society. The climate during the Viking Age was relatively mild, allowing for agriculture to flourish in regions like Iceland and Greenland. However, by the 11th century, the climate began to cool, leading to shorter growing seasons and reduced agricultural yields. This change in climate, known as the medieval cool period, put additional strain on Viking settlements, particularly in the more marginal regions of the North Atlantic. The combination of declining economic opportunities and environmental pressures made it increasingly difficult for Viking societies to sustain themselves. The settlements in Greenland, for example, eventually collapsed, due in part to a combination of environmental stress and declining trade with Europe. As the economic and environmental challenges mounted, Viking societies were forced to adapt, often by integrating more fully into the Christian European world and abandoning their traditional ways of life. That brings us to the end of the video. The end of the Viking Age was not the result of a single event or factor, but rather the culmination of a complex set of social, cultural, economic, and environmental changes. The spread of Christianity, the rise of stronger centralized kingdoms, the changing nature of family life and sexual norms, and the economic and environmental pressures all played a role in bringing this era to an end. But while the Viking Age may have ended, the legacy of the Vikings lives on. Their influence can still be seen today in the place names, languages, and cultures of the regions they once inhabited. The Vikings were not just warriors and raiders. They were also explorers, traders, and settlers who left an indelible mark on the history of Europe and the world. As we reflect on the history of the Vikings and the factors that brought their era to an end, let us remember that history is not just about dates and events. It is about people, real people who lived, loved, fought, and died, leaving behind stories that continue to captivate and inspire us to this day. The story of the Vikings is one such story, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of a people who, for a time, ruled the seas and shaped the course of history. If you found this exploration of Viking history as fascinating as we do, make sure to hit the like button and share this video with others who might be interested in the untold stories of the past. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most intriguing eras. Let us know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like us to cover next. Remember, history is alive in the stories we choose to tell. Let's keep discovering them together.